Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Sarah. I'm a labor journalist. I'm the editor of. And yeah, I guess I'll just read your bios. Okay. Unless you want to introduce yourself.
No, that's totally fine.
So Sarah is a senior writer for Intelligencer who covers class, religion, Christian nationalism, and politics, and has written for New York Magazine since 2018. Previously a staff writer for The New Republic, and is the author of Disposable. As you can see, I have a very beat up copy, which means I really engaged it. So it's Disposable, America's Contempt for the Underclass. Yeah, and we're so happy to have Sarah here. So I think we were going to just kick it off by me sort of sharing some thoughts about the meaning of the concept of disposability for this moment. And then Sarah can do more of an introduction of herself and then also read an excerpt and talk about it. And then I have some questions, and then you all are welcome to ask questions too. And we do have some folks tuning in via live stream as well. But yeah, so, I just wanted to say, this is kind of an obvious thing to say, but the concept of disposability and this idea of refusing to forget those who have been deemed disposable is really resonant right now, as the Trump administration uses disposability, precarity, and actual disappearances as tools of social control. The welfare state is being eroded at a head-spinning pace as the quote unquote security state or the violent parts of the state are being expanded, all under the razor thin auspices of efficiency. I'm sure you all are familiar with the stuff that's going on. International students are being abducted for thought crimes. Migrants are being deported to brutal prisons with no due process. Trump is continuing and escalating the Biden administration's genocide in Gaza, and everywhere we look, we see evidence that basic human worth and dignity are being denied forcefully, and death and destitution or the threat of those things are everywhere. And I know that's a very grim way to open, but that's just the reality. But there's also a lot that death can teach us, death and loss. They can teach us about how our society works, where the contradictions lie. And there's a political power that comes with remembering, and these were and are the brutal lessons of the pandemic, and we're seeing today why these lessons are really important. So with that, I'll kick it to Sarah, who's going to just share a little bit about the project and then read an excerpt.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming out tonight. So that was a great introduction. Thank you. I think it really sets up the project really well and kind of the moment that it arrives in. I'll just explain a little bit about how the book came to be, and then I'll lead into, I'm going to read just a little excerpt from the final chapter of the book. But essentially, I had been covering labor and class for a number of years, first at the New Republic and then at New York Magazine when the pandemic struck. And kind of in the early weeks and months of the pandemic, I spent a lot of time talking to people we now call essential workers. So people who were working in fast food restaurants and Amazon warehouses and facilities like that, grocery stores, about what they were experiencing on the job. And so I very much had inequality on the mind, and I felt it was important as a reporter to frame it in that way for the people who were reading my stories, like really connecting the human stories that were coming forth during the pandemic to a much older narrative about inequality in the US and like who is typically bearing the brunt of natural disasters, whether it's a pandemic or Hurricane Katrina or you name it. And then in late August 2020, my grandfather contracted COVID and ultimately ended up dying from the virus. And obviously when that happened, it was a personal tragedy for me and for my family, but I also felt very strongly that it was a political tragedy. It was a political death. And I felt that was true of all the COVID deaths. My grandfather wasn't really unusual in that way. He was a working class person. He, had served in the army and worked a series of odd jobs his whole life. And my family's not destitute, but we've struggled. Like we were never financially very secure when I was growing up. And my grandfather had a good, safe place to live, but as he needed more care, we just weren't able to provide like the top-notch level care that we wish that we had been able to. And so when he got the virus, he was in a rehab facility. He'd been sort of in and out of facilities like it. Some of them were okay, a lot of them weren't. And in my view, anyway, that was what made him kind of uniquely susceptible to contracting the virus and coming into contact with it in the first place. And so these two strands kind of came together in my head, and I realized I wanted to tell a much bigger story about who lives and who dies in America during the pandemic and during crises like it. And that is how Disposable came to be. And that idea of disposability ended up becoming really important to the book. So with that in mind, I'm going to read a little bit from the final chapter, and to just give you a little bit of context. I wrote it when I was actually living in my grandfather's old cabin for a little bit, and it's very rural. We do have neighbors, but and I don't drive, so it was like very isolated. So I had a lot of time to think, and this is what I thought about. In my grandfather's cabin, the world is silent. Outside, the natural world goes on. I hear wind chimes, birds, the occasional cat. Someone might break in, I tell myself. I fear other humans, some threat I can touch. 2 weeks pass like this, and by the time I go home to New York, I'm certain there is no afterlife. If my grandfather could be anywhere, I think he would be in the cabin. There, he spent the last few years of his life, 1,000 miles from where he grew up, a choice he'd made to be close to us, his family. I think he'd make that choice a second time if anyone could, but the cabin holds nothing. The silence is absolute. I am haunted, but not by him, and that is a source of grief. A ghost might frighten me, but it would also prove that something remains of the dead. What is for some a certainty is for me an absence. I reach out and I only feel the air. Because I'm an atheist, I believe the dead are no longer present. They were, and now they are not, and our loss is harsher for it. To me, the most important fact of life is that it ends. Without eternity, we only have a brief time on the earth, which means that we have certain responsibilities to each other and to the dead. Once departed, the dead remain part of our world, not because there is an afterlife, but because they still matter to us. They have no voice, and they do not speak except through our own mouths. They do not live on except in our minds. Mass death, then, is a crisis of memory. When we speak of the people we've lost, the dead appear not as ghosts, but as extensions of ourselves. Memories of the dead hold up a mirror to the living. What we choose to recall and what we choose to forget are personal decisions with political import. My grandfather is not a ghost, but as a memory, he is a warning. Over 4 years after COVID first appeared, it still kills hundreds by the week in the US alone. On a global level, the losses are even more catastrophic. Yet America is perilously close to choosing amnesia. Let the dead bury the dead, Jesus once told a man, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Here there's no God but the free market. The COVID dead can't be saved, and there's work to do. In a society calloused by capitalism, the act of memory is not only political but radical. To remember the disposable is to lose confidence in the process that killed him. Our recent losses, though, present at such scale that they can be difficult to fix in the mind. Great epidemics, like world wars and famines, massify death into species-level events beyond our emotional comprehension, wrote the late historian Mike Davis in his 2005 book on the avian flu. The afflicted, as a result, die twice. Their physical agonies are redoubled by the submergence of their personalities in the black water of mega-tragedy. He added, no one mourns a multitude, or keens at the grave with an abstraction. Well over 1 million lie dead from COVID in the United States, and there is no outcry. It may be, as Davis argues, that we lack some biological solidarity that is automatically aroused by the destruction of our fellow kind. Yet our hearts are less settled than they first appear. The dead do not haunt us, but they do not have to. We are haunting each other instead. The world is reopened, but we can't outrun our losses. Pick America apart at the seams, and there is grief underneath. Because the dead and their multitudes have become an abstraction, grief belongs to the individual bereaved, while those in power are ready to forget. I fear I have lost more than my grandfather. When I am angry, and this is often, I am angry at a system that oppressed him in life and erased him in death. We who mourn the COVID dead are not haunted by their ghosts, but by a political economy that reduces human beings to their labor or worse. In such a system, there is hardly room for millions to live. For them, there is work and then death. COVID merely accelerated the cycle, but we can break it if we try. Every benefit industrialism and capitalism have brought us, every wonderful advance in knowledge and health and communication and comfort casts the same fatal shadow, the late science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin once warned. She spoke of capitalism's environmental crimes, but as it attacks the earth, it assaults the human spirit as well. The only answer is a radical one. Exercise an inhuman political economy from the national body and replace it with something else, something we haven't yet tried. That future need not be science fiction at all, as Le Guin suggested before her death. We live under capitalism, she once said in a now famous speech. Its power seems inescapable, so do the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. We need nothing less than a new and more democratic order.
It's funny, the excerpt that I had picked out is actually buried within that. So.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
It worked
out. Those concepts are so powerful. I think one of the quotes in there was one that really hit me the hardest, this idea that mass death is a crisis of memory. You know, you talk in the book about the importance of remembering its political power, how it's a political act. And part of why that's so important is because who lives and who dies during mass deaths like the pandemic reveal a great deal about our society. I think there was a quote like taking apart society at the seams and looking at it and understanding it in a new way. I was wondering, I know this is very broad, so feel free to answer it however you want, but I was wondering if you could just talk about what the pandemic revealed about our society. When we pull it apart at the seams and look at it, what do we see?
Right. I feel like when anyone does that, starts picking it apart at the seams in that way, I think one of the things that becomes most immediately apparent is cruelty and injustice, but especially cruelty. And I don't think sort of identifying that cruelty is the place you end, but I do think it's a really good starting place. Like, okay, if this is cruelty, like, why is it happening? How did it happen? You know, what can we look to history and maybe understand that it had these antecedents that are influencing what happens now, but also who's responsible for it. You know, that impulse is what pushed me left in the first place after growing up in a very conservative environment, and it's what shapes my journalism too. And I think that is certainly not unique to me. The sources I interviewed for the book had very much kind of the same feeling kind of wherever they were on the spectrum. This impulse to pick it apart and ask why.
Yeah. And it seems like your grandfather's death was an occasion in your own life to ask that question with you. And I'm very sorry to hear about your grandfather's death, and you were very vulnerable in sharing that, and I think it's really good for people to just be transparent about the state and sort of what's tying them to the issue. And so I think that I had a few quotes that you had that I just wanted to pull out. So I think you are really trying to get away from this idea that his death was a tragedy. You say his fate is as political as it is biological and serious. You talk about the idea that, quote, weaklings and moochers must die. But you also talk about aging into poverty, the predatory practices of United Healthcare's Medicare Advantage. One of the most striking lines to me in your writing about your grandfather was when your mom was talking about the medical system and insurance providers treating him, how they treated him when his health started to plummet. Quote, they're treating him like he's already in a body bag.
Yeah.
What did your grandfather's life and death teach you about the politics of disposability, and what does justice look like for him?
It taught me so much about disposability. I think when I think about it, I think there are two things that are important to keep in mind. And one is that I think it's much easier for people to fall into that state than we often realize, or are taught to sort of think about. And once you're in it, it's very hard to escape. And so, my grandfather came of age and started his working life at a time where it was a little more possible to maybe cobble together some work, and they were eventually able to buy a house, and it was really hard for them, and they weren't able to kind of keep it in the end, which I think I go into in the book. But for a while they were able to do that, but even that wasn't able to sort of guarantee him much of a safety net in old age. And that's a very common problem. And for me, like, it was very important to me to not just write about my grandfather as an individual, but as a member of a class.
Mm-hmm.
And so to think about where his experiences and kind of intersect with the experiences of other people for structural and material reasons. And I really wanted to get that across in the book. You know, you mentioned Medicare Advantage.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really big part of the story, and kind of what the Trump administration posed to expand it, as I understand it. I'm concerned that what happened to my grandfather is going to become even more common, even as we kind of are in this stage of the pandemic right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think all of the dynamics that you described in your book are just intensifying so rapidly right now. But they were sort of already in motion before this moment. I want to talk a little bit about the act of remembering. I think we were talking before this started about Sarah Jaffe's new wonderful book From the Ashes, and I think like collective grief and grief as a political act is just something that is on the minds of people who are still really struggling with the reality of the pandemic, people who have lost people who are trying to make sense of that loss, or if you can't make sense of it, at least try to make change and try to prevent people from being treated like they're disposable. So you wrote, when a loved one dies, the act of remembrance takes on a ritual significance. Memories bring the dead close and hold them there well after the body is no more. But when a death is political, this ritual becomes radical. Memory paints flesh on bones some would prefer to keep buried. You also say that anger can be part of this ritual. Mm-hmm. Quote, sometimes anger is justified, even useful. Marshaled by the living on behalf of the dead, anger can even become a power of its own. So these themes of remembrance and anger, they just run throughout the book.
Right.
They're reflected in your own experiences and the experiences of others that you talk to through your reporting. I found them refreshing personally in a society where so many just want to move on and bury the horrors of the pandemic, not even talk about it, honestly pretend like it didn't happen. Can you please talk about the usefulness of remembrance and anger? And I think how that usefulness carries over right now at a time when sort of the Trump administration is, for lack of a better term, mobilizing a politics of death and eroding the welfare state.
Yeah. For me, the way I think about it is the act of memory and the act of mourning somebody is also a way to say that this person mattered and their life mattered, and to assign meaning to them in a society that would often deny them that and strip it away. And so I think that's why it's so radical. And I think I say this elsewhere in the book, but I think there are so many forces that are sort of stacked against the ability to remember and the ability to grieve. I mean, think about how hard it is for people to just take time off work when a loved one passes away, or to care for them in their final days. Like, not everybody has that right.
Yeah.
Even if you do, I mean, I think when we're thinking about the mass death that occurred in the pandemic specifically, I write in the book that I think we as a society, because of our political economy, because of capitalism, had become accustomed to a certain level of mass death. Like, mass death is not like unique to COVID. It's kind of always been there beneath the surface of American society. And the people who live in closer proximity to it can ignore it, but people who don't, I think it's very profitable for them to do that. Mm-hmm. And I think that also makes the act of memory and the act of grief so radical and so important.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. In a society that doesn't even have like a national paid bereavement leave policy, it's not a right that American workers have. Your boss might voluntarily give that to you, but it's not right as a policy.
Right.
Yeah. So like making space to mourn and to recognize loss in itself is sort of an act of like rehumanizing yourself in a way. Okay, I want to talk about the concept of social murder because this is such a powerful concept. Um, so, as the welfare state is being rapidly gutted, and Congress is eyeing major cuts to things like Medicaid, the idea of social murder, I think, is particularly important. Um, I just was hoping you could explain what this concept is for people who might not be familiar with that term
Yeah.
or where it comes from, and sort of how would you describe its relevance now, as we're seeing a billionaire orchestrated power grab, I think correctly described as a coup, um, and sort of a really rapid transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich.
Right. That concept ended up being really key to the book, and it also really helped me understand not just what happened to my grandfather, but the stories I was hearing from the sources who spoke to me for the book. And I wasn't the only one who kind of drew a connection between what happened during the pandemic and to this notion of social debt or social murder. But to give a little bit of context, it comes from Engels, and I'm paraphrasing a great deal, but essentially kind of arguing that when society is structured in a way that poor people are dying prematurely, dying in pain, dying of injury, dying of illness that could have been prevented, that death is murder as much as if someone pulled the trigger. And it's a very bold statement, but I think it was right then and it remains apt now. And I think it's kind of the only way to sort of understand this notion of disposability and the sort of preventable death that happened during the pandemic. And also, as you said, like it remains so applicable to what's going on right now, especially I had a piece a few weeks ago for New York talking about kind of this concerted Trump administration and GOP attack on disability rights and protections and services for people with disabilities. And I think you can bring that notion in there too.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Like disposability isn't just a natural disaster or
Right.
act of God.
No, you're not. You may be
Yeah.
born disposable. That's something that somebody has inflicted on you. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah.
Yeah. So your book had a lot of reporting. It was a great thing about it. You just talked to a lot of people and it gave it vividness and it kept it grounded. One of the people you talked to was Ana Celia Martinez, whose death I found really devastating, partially because her kids just tried so hard to save her. They had no information. They were allegedly misled by the home she was staying in. Their helplessness and desperation, and then not even being able to be with her before she died out of fear of catching the virus, and seeing her connected to machines reminds me of the fear and horror of the worst times of the pandemic. And I think, we all, no one is completely removed from that horror. Some experience it far more directly than others, but for me personally, that just really struck a chord.
Yeah.
And it also makes me think about generational discourse and narratives that older people have it easier, that quote unquote boomers are a privileged class.
Yeah.
And actually, it seems that elderly people clearly emerged as an oppressed class during the pandemic. Can you talk about the specific cruelties unleashed upon elders during this time and sort of tell people about the story of Anna?
Yeah. So Anna's story, it was really moving. It was all the stories were kind of difficult to take in their own way, but I'm very grateful that they were shared with me, and people were willing to do that. And I think Anna's story is so instructive, kind of for the reasons you outlined. Like they, according to the sisters or her daughters, they were misled. They didn't get the information they needed. There was this separation between themselves and their mother had, had a very difficult upbringing. She lost loved ones when she was very young, and she worked very hard her whole life to raise her family. And, to use the conservatives would look at that and be like, oh, she pulled herself up by her bootstraps. But did she really? Because she did age into this situation that was very precarious, and she was not necessarily in a very good facility. But I think its flaws maybe only became more obvious during the pandemic. And so she died from the virus, and she was really confused and she was alone before her death. And I found that kind of the most tragic aspect of that she was not able to take in comfort at that point anymore. And that really, I use this phrase elsewhere in the book, but this notion of two pandemics. And I think that was particularly apparent when you look at seniors. Some seniors are able to kind of afford care that like created a buffer between them and the virus a little bit, but that wasn't true for a lot of people. And for biological reasons, seniors were much more susceptible to severe complications and death from the virus. And so I quoted a gerontologist who was talking about this notion of the two pandemics and how he saw that play out. And unfortunately, I think you can see that in Anna's story too. And I do think that there's this notion that, one generation is maybe a little better off than the other. I don't know that that's entirely wrong, but I do find it a little simplistic because there are so many people for whom that isn't true. And if you kind of look at the data and the research that I put in the book, we're asking seniors to work longer and longer just to be able to support themselves in their old age. There are a lot of arguments that it's actually good for them, and kind of the position that I ended on, like they should have kind of a free choice about it, and they don't have one right now. They're sort of pushed into this position where they have to keep working so they can support themselves and not enjoy their senior years the way that they might like to. And that was the situation going into the pandemic, and it really just, it left so many seniors like Anna just completely wide open to deaths that could have been prevented.
The idea of there being two pandemics just makes me think a lot about sort of the crowing about the heroism of quote unquote essential workers, and how in retrospect it's really clear that just the language around that was really about disciplining labor.
Yeah.
And rewarding people with praise when they really didn't get huge raises. And it makes me think about grocery workers. So this year, 130,000 union members who are grocery workers are going to see their contracts expire in 2025. And if you look at the issues that they're fighting for, it's the same issues that were a problem during the pandemic and before, which is low pay, understaffing, disrespect, difficult working conditions.
Yeah.
And then it's making me think about how you had sort of, all these people from Wall Street saying, oh, we need to reopen, we need to rush to reopen. And I was working in these times at the time, and my coworker Hamilton Nolan wrote a piece that was like, oh, you bankers want to reopen, you first. Are you volunteering to go be a server in restaurants? Are you volunteering to go be a doorman? Are you going to go work in grocery stores? Because I'm pretty sure when you talk about putting other people in peril, you're not talking about your own kids. You're not talking about yourself. You're talking about the working class.
Yeah.
And I think that this idea of two pandemics also just really comes down to class. And I think some of the shortcomings of generational discourse is that they can obscure class differences. It's not like old people are privileged and young people aren't. It's like there's a class, and if you're part of the poor or working class, your experience of the pandemic is going to be really different.
Yeah, and I think that's true even for a lot of people who we might consider to be middle class. Like, it's just so burdensome and so expensive that I think, I think about my mom, for example, who was taking care of my grandfather before he died, and is now taking care of my father who's older, and that's very isolating and hard for her. And and it is falling kind of predominantly on women, and not just women but women of color, so domestic workers in addition to family members who are looking after loved ones. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot, not just in terms of the pandemic, but I think it sort of punctures this generational discourse that we talk about a lot.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. I mean, in our healthcare system, unless you're ultra wealthy, you're one medical crisis away from losing everything.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, so, you talked about women and women of color during the brunt. One thing I think your piece did a great job of, your book did a great job of, is looking at the racial wealth gap.
Yeah.
And also the need for reparations, and how crises like the pandemic expose the need for reparations, and sort of the collective failure in the U.S. to really grapple with the legacies of slavery and how they have created this tremendous gap in sort of not just who has wealth, but who has access to circles of wealth.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, during the height of the pandemic, there was a lot of reporting, some of it better than others, about obviously Black Americans, for example, were much more likely to have, disabilities or certain chronic health conditions that made them a lot more susceptible to complications and death from COVID. And so we were getting that piece of it, but I really wanted to dig in to a little more of the data and the research, but also the history of it, and just really sort of make the case. Like, I found a really interesting paper where, they, according to them, like, if we had a program of reparations before the pandemic, fewer Black Americans in particular would have died. And I thought about that a lot. And then I have the story of Ebony and her husband Terrence, who died from the virus. And he had health conditions, and they'd sort of carved out this place for themselves in the middle class, but like just barely. And then when he died and they lost his income, the house went into foreclosure. They lost a car. It was just brutal for them. And they were living on the edge already, and COVID just pushed them right over. And so I really wanted to connect that to that sort of narrative about reparations and like what we owe people, who we have an obligation to.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly important. It's so stark. Like, you can just look at numbers and see, like, look at the numbers of Black people who died, Native Americans who died, or people, at or below the poverty line.
Yeah.
It's just so grim and so stark. It's quantified. And it says a great deal about who is valued and who is not in our society.
Yeah.
Okay, so people who you talk to in this book are not just victims, they are also organizers. They are sort of organizers in their personal lives. They talk about trying to survive, trying to help family members survive. But then there are also organizers in the political sense. You talk a little bit about labor organizing. You talk about other forms of organizing. What are some examples of organizing that you take heart in, and that we can sort of look to right now as we're all really terrified of what's happening politically in this country?
Yeah, that's a really important piece of the book, because people may be considered disposable by society, but they are by no means passive, and they never have been. And so we can look to the labor movement, we can look to the welfare rights movement, we can look to the civil rights movement, we can look to the disability rights movement. And those are all kind of narratives that I wanted to wrap into the book to like really point out, like, people have been resisting this for a really long time. And, resistance, the idea of resistance, particularly during the first Trump administration, was really popular, and we saw it everywhere. But I was interested in this notion of like resistance with like teeth, and like what it means to organize under these conditions. So that was really important to me. And I think there are some areas where I kind of wish I'd incorporated more. Like, I've been thinking a lot about the tenant rights movement. In reporting the book, there so many of my sources, housing insecurity was a big part of their story. And so I think the tenants' right movement is a place where I would look right now, especially as rents keep going up and things get more and more precarious. I think there's a lot of incredible work happening there. I think about the reproductive justice movement, which I think has always sort of been opposed to this notion of disposability in its heart. And I look there for that. And I still look to the labor movement, of course. Like, I'm very proud to be a union member, and it's really, really changed my life in a number of ways. And I want that for everybody else, that greater level of material security is something everybody deserves.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, I remember it being such a hard time, especially during the physical distancing or social distancing, whatever you want to call it, and creating a sense of the collective and a sense of being in it together was really challenging. But some people really figured it out and did incredible work. And I think it's really admirable and shows that you can really organize under incredible duress.
Yeah, I write about solidarity in the book too, like especially towards the end, and I think that's the only way through.
Yeah, it's the literal opposite of these death-making policies in moments of crisis. Well, I want to open it up to the room and see if anyone has any thoughts, any questions, anything you want to share or ask Sarah. Um, this book has a lot of great stuff in it, so like I don't know, there are plenty of things that we could sink our teeth into. Just curious if folks have thoughts.
One thing that came up to me as Tony was thinking about Russell's work done whiteness and how in that book they interviewed a bunch of like working class white people and we're talking about the expansion of the Affordable Care Act and like people were against the Affordable Care Act because of anti-blackness. And so I was wondering if you saw any type of kind of like racial awareness and also class awareness that unfolded during the pandemic and kind of like maybe like a, oh, I see what happened, or was that kind of invisibilized in people's experience?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's something I do think about a lot. I'm from a very rural, very white area, and where people love to talk about the white working class, and I think anti-blackness explains very like how it's become so deep red where I'm from. Um, I don't know that even among the people I talked to, and I spoke to people from all backgrounds, different cultures, different races, like different ways of life, and um, some of them are a little more aware of that than others, I think. I don't know that it's led to sort of the sense of solidarity that I would personally like to see. I finished the book before the reelection of Trump, and that's something that I've been sort of contending with a lot in the wake of that and thinking about how and why that happened. Yeah.
Like how now that we're actually seeing the gutting of the well, thinking about how we can kind of like make the connection more explicit for people so that people can mobilize around that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
Like disposable is like an identity of those who've been disposed, but it has very passive, which is making me think about like the dynamics of this place. And it's like, who is the actor who is doing the harm, and who is being scapegoated in those dynamics, and how is that unfolding? I'm curious on that in a sense of like understanding race consciousness in the ways in which it's perpetuating continual legacy of slavery through all of these continued policies. But when people are processing this in a lived experience, are they associating that with a government policy? Are they associating it with your neighbor who is an immigrant? Like the ways we're seeing this unfold when there is harm and trauma is part of that trauma now being scapegoated into what we're seeing now with Trump's politics and those who are supporting it? Or is there a possibility for an consciousness and like an awareness of what's happening? And like, is there tension in people who are in that lived pain memory of holding their loved ones who've been passed? Are they also seeing that solidarity with others who don't look like them but are experiencing such severe harm? And so it's this funny thing of like, I don't understand that dynamic, but I feel like it's up right now.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to shift the actor in it because I feel like we're looking to each other to say blame, like the nearest neighbor, for who probably is more in your more similar boat than those who are actually enacting the harm. But even like the title disposable still is about the identity of the person versus the action of those who are disposing of us. Blame on them. Yeah. I want to talk about the actor. Like this, not, it's like cruelty, but like cruelty, it's not passive. It's an intentional slaughtering. Right. And it's not being done by each other unless it's being done by a select few who have the capabilities to do that. So yeah, so there's more of a comment, but I'm curious if any of that stuff did come into play about how people made sense of this in those last moments, and did families understand and make sense of it? Who are they angry at? Who are they angry at?
Yeah, it really varied from sort of family to family and individual to individual. And some people were very angry at the Trump administration and sort of identified him as the major actor that disposed of them. And I don't think other people did. And I think you've identified a really important sort of question, especially for organizing going forward, because one of the reasons I was drawn to the notion of disposability is because someone is disposing of you, as you said. Like it is an active process. someone is doing that to you, someone is inflicting that on you. And the only way that I've sort of been able to make sense of it going forward is just by starting the conversation with someone by telling them this anger that you're feeling, and that is an emotion that almost everyone I taught to express, kind of no matter where they were on the political spectrum. Like, that anger is naturally actually good, but let's talk about who did this to you, who actually is responsible for this. And it's not immigrants taking your job, right? It's just not. It's not people on welfare. And it's not even just Trump. It's much older and much bigger than that. But I think that's where we have to start.
Do you think that our landscape of like how media operates makes that more challenging to hold that memory, right? So like even today, like I heard that like the politicians are like, oh, you can go without, some of these luxury grocery items or luxury things. And, I wonder how, Trump supporters are, hearing that. And so I'm wondering how, like, I guess misinformation can really change your experience and also memory of things.
I think the media landscape is really
important, and I think there are different like pieces of that to think about. One is just the fact that, thanks in part to private equity, local newspapers are just being destroyed across the country, and so people are losing access to a source of reported news in their community. And that wasn't even just important for like understanding what's going on, but we're like sort of a way to hold the community together. And that's disappearing. I mean, not disappearing, it's just being removed, it's being eradicated. At the same time, you have social media now, and again, like who's starting these companies, who runs these companies. Like Mark Zuckerberg has become very kind of open and explicit about his right-wing views, right? And of course everybody knows what happened to Twitter, but like when these are your alternatives to like the community newspaper that's no longer there, I mean, I think your chances of getting real information that helps you make sense of the world and your position in it is made much more difficult for structural and financial reasons. And then at the same time, I think we have to think about sort of the remaining news outlets we have left and kind of how they approach the news and how they approach their journalism. I'm in a position where I get to sort of bring an opinion and analysis and a view to my work, and that would not be true for journalists at other publications. And while they claim neutrality, I think when you actually look at what they're writing, it's not neutral at all. It's very tilted in a way that I think sort of scaffolds and sort of upholds the ruling class. It doesn't challenge it, or at least not as often or as reliably as I think it should.
We got a couple from the live stream.
So one that always one of the questions out there is if you'd be able to talk a little bit more about the memory hole of COVID in relationship to disposability, and specifically what you make of the fact that when COVID is discussed, it's most often as a way to score points on either side of the political aisle.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. It's been so frustrating to me. I mean, there have been a few other books out, and I haven't read them all, so I can't, I will try not to like get over my skis here, to use one of my mother's favorite expressions. But what I will say is like that tendency is very real. And so a tendency that I've noticed that I find deeply frustrating is this talk about like sort of the laptop class and how they were very comfortable during COVID. And, this discussion of like masking and school lockdowns as a way to score points against each other. No, you don't really care about the working class. No one's really talking about the risks that teachers were being expected to take. No one's really talking about the risks that, they were kind of expecting kids to take or their families to take. And I feel like that is indicative partially of kind of the broken media landscape that we were just talking about, where even among people who maybe aren't reporters and are like writing essays, can't really like break out of this mold where they're just scoring points and they're not really thinking about the human lives that were at stake. It's just a way to like kind of wage culture war all over again. And I find that really concerning.
another one. Well, no, we're getting.
You mentioned in your response to a previous question that you finished the book before the election, and that obviously you've been grappling since then with the causes of the results of the election. So I was wondering, but you kind of left it at that, so I was curious if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah.
You've touched on it a little bit, and I think some of your other comments, but I'd be really curious to hear you address that head on.
Yeah, it's
When I was writing the book, obviously I knew the election was coming, and I kind of wanted to, especially with that final chapter, leave it kind of open in a way that, wasn't going to age poorly depending on who won the election, because I think we're talking about structural issues that, like I said, are much older than Biden and much older than Trump, and I knew we're still going to be there no matter who was going to be president. But I have been thinking about his reelection and the fact that he was able to make more inroads with the working class. And it's obviously a failure of the Democratic Party, but I think it's bigger than that too. It's just, I feel like all the incentives under capitalism are for people not to remember and for people to like get back to work and not think about it and not reflect. And that is, I think, a huge part of the story. I don't know that it explains everything exactly. I'm still sort of puzzling it out myself. I think about, I grew up evangelical, and the Christian right is obviously so important right now, and our relationship to death and how widespread I think that's become. And it's almost like, well, there's eternal life, you're going to go be with Jesus. And as white evangelicals often write and think about it, it's like not really thinking about the circumstances that people are living under. It's like, oh, they have eternity, so whatever. And it's a way of kind of hand waving past it. And so I think that element is there too. But I think it's there's no single explanation for it. I've been thinking about a lot of different possibilities.
I agree with that. And I think there's a tendency amongst a lot of our fellow leftists, amongst people in general. I think everybody had their pet theory or single explanation for, it was this, it was that. And for those of us on the left, it's typically like, well, it was obviously the fact that the Democratic Party ran such a, pathetically center-right, neoliberal, pro-genocide, anti-leftist.
yeah.
And that explains some of it. But there were a lot of voters that's not the explanation for why some people voted for Trump. And there were some voters who actually thought that Kamala Harris was too progressive on some issues.
Right.
Now, as insane as that sounds to a progressive, that is a fact that millions of people felt that way.
Right.
And it's hard, I think it's hard for a lot of people to hold both thoughts at once. For us, Kamala Harris was too far to the right.
Yeah.
So we assume that, obviously that's why she lost the race, because she was too far to the right. The Democratic Party failed to put up with a progressive. That's kind of, I think, collapsing our normative judgments and political wishes with the actual empirical reality of where lots of people are, which is in very different kinds of places.
Yeah. I agree with that.
I think I would just add to kind of what you just said and what I just said. I think there's a particularly American tendency to sort of worship, for lack of a better word, the great businessman, and that's an idea that I grew up with that had very religious overtones, but I don't think it was by any means unique to white evangelicalism. I think it's very much sort of embedded in the American consciousness, and it's sort of integral to this idea of the American dream and meritocracy. You can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and be this great billionaire or millionaire because you deserve it, because you've earned it. And I think that's a factor too. I think people looked at Trump and were living in sort of economic circumstances that made them think, well, I need someone to come and help me. This great businessman is going to do that. So that's something I've been thinking about too.
Was there a question from
So, Your discussion of social murder, your discussion of social murder in the book is really spot on. Useful. It especially brought to mind the systemic hypocrisy that came around the murder of United Healthcare CEO at the end of last year. Do you think we're likely to see more acts of individual desperation, given how widespread and transparent social?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I did write about
the murder when it happened, and my take on it is still sort of the take that I have now, which is that it was inevitable for material reasons, and also just the fact that guns are so accessible. I think you combine those two things, and it's a very combustible combination. So I wouldn't make any predictions, but I do think, especially as things become more unstable, I worry that people feel like they don't have an outlet for that anger that they're feeling. I worry that, the Democratic Party is certainly not going to like talk to them and tell them here's who you should be angry at and here's what we can do about it. Like, that's not happening. And because it's not happening, I do worry that people would take matters into their own hands in that way. If I had to make a guess, I don't think that's going to be the last act of its kind that we see.
Not a live question, but I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
That's okay. So you talked a little bit tonight about contempt and specifically how it's directed at us, both from people sitting on top of society and from the bottom up. And I'm really curious what you think about why this has become such an important political force. Like,
Yeah.
what explains that as such a key component? So much of what we're seeing.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that in terms of just the
show to those who are unhoused and just the absolute rage that a shelter might move into the neighborhood, right? Or the acts of violence that people will inflict on somebody who's sleeping on the street. I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think when I think about contempt in that context, I think that there's almost an element of fear to it. I have this quote from Barbara Ehrenreich in the book, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's like this middle class fear that they could become that. And in fact, the distance between themselves and that person is perhaps not as pronounced as they would like it to be. And then you have this sort of contempt shown by somebody like J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, Donald Trump. I don't mean to keep bringing it back to them, but I do think it's such an important feature of their rhetoric and their policy. Like this use of the R word as a slur that Elon Musk is so fond of, that's an act of contempt. And I don't know that that's necessarily about fear, but it's about putting somebody in their place, right? It's about hierarchy, it's about power, and making sure that the person who's on the receiving end of that slur knows that they are held in contempt and they're an enemy and they're going to be kept in that inferior position. So it's a way of disciplining people almost, I think.
Okay, any more questions? Any thoughts? Thanks so much for coming out,
Thank
everyone. And thank you, Sarah, for writing this book. I think that the questions you struggle with and your refusal to turn away from the immense, incomprehensible loss that our society endured is exactly the right struggle to be engaged in, but certainly not easy, and certainly one that you have a personal stake in. You talk very openly about your own loss and connect it politically in a way that is so powerful and so needed, and identifies, like you say, structures that pre-existed the pandemic and continue into the present day, and I think shed light on this national nightmare that we're all trapped inside of right now.
Yeah.
While also uplifting organizing and agency among those people who are most harmed by these systems, and really refusing this neoliberal thing where you're just a witness to suffering but never a perpetrator.
Yeah.
And you struggle, like the struggle is figuring out who is to blame.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the intellectual project that you are invested in, and that's just so important because you can't transform these systems without identifying and naming who is responsible and who's doing the harm. So yeah, thanks for writing this book. I encourage people to check it out. I got a lot out of reading it, and thank you, Sarah, for sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.